Good morning. I'm grateful to be able to use this technology for us this morning so that I am able to be present with you, even when I'm unable to be present physically with you. Thanks so much to Janine Boyer for worship leading for us this morning and for everybody who is involved in making sure things are going well. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Juliet is correct in that the name for a thing is often just that, something by which we call an object that we have all agreed upon to some extent so that we can communicate together with one another. But a theologian, a Bible scholar, Juliet is not. Names have purpose and meaning in the Bible. Place names tell us something about the place's history, what has gone on there before, who lives there, where they are at, and the geography of the place. People's names in the Bible likewise say something about who that person is, their character and their relationship to God and to others. It's appropriate this morning that we are talking about names and naming. I am currently back home in Illinois officiating the memorial service of my grandma Shanks. Today would have been her 92nd birthday. Grandma's given name was Frances, though I've never heard anyone, anytime, anywhere, for any reason, use that name. Maybe my great-grandmother once upon a time. Presumably in the hospital and in doctors' offices, they probably used that name. But I've always heard her called Janine, which was her middle name. At our large extended family reunions, she was there often referred to as Neener or Aunt Neener. The lore, as I recall it, is that the younger of her two brothers and her next youngest sister couldn't say Janine when they were little, and so she became Neener. As the oldest of seven, she was, by the time that Bob and Linda came along, probably doing a lot of the child care in the family. She became Neener to them, to their kids, to the rest of the family. That was my mom's mom. My grandpa Batterton, my dad's dad, always went by his middle name too. His first name, Jasper, was his grandfather's name, and that's where Reed's middle name comes from. But Grandpa hated that name for himself. He always went by his middle name, Junior. In my mind, he couldn't have ever been anything else, of course. This is the way that I knew him. This was his preference in molding who he was as a person, just as my dad was Ricky as a boy and grew into being Rick and really never Richard. Just as I was Jimmy when I was little and grew into being Jim, but never really James. Our choices, to a great extent. We were not given new names by God. God didn't change our names in order to seal us into a covenant together with God. Names mean something in the biblical text, and as I said, when God changes your name, it means something. In our text this morning, we get first get a name for God. God calls themselves El Shaddai, God Almighty, God on the mountain. This is the first occurrence of this name for God in the Bible. God will identify themselves again as El Shaddai to Abraham's grandson Jacob in chapter 35 of Genesis, and it occurs in other books of the Bible as well, for instance, in Job and Ezekiel. Further in the text, God renames Abram. Up to this point in the story, this man who has faithfully followed God from his homeland into Canaan has been known as Abram, or exalted ancestor. His name has been something of a joke, frankly, in his life, because he has no offspring. At 99 years of age, Abram is the exalted ancestor of precisely no descendants. But God makes Abram and Sarai the promise of great nations who will come from their descendants and be a blessing to the entire world. He seals this covenant promise by changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. In Abram's case, his name's meaning changes from exalted ancestor to ancestor of multitudes. The language of the covenant makes clear that this is no mere transactional agreement. This is a covenant of promise, and that promise is relational. Walk with me and be trustworthy, God says. What does Abram or Abraham have to bring to the table for God? Nothing, really. Just himself and Sarai, herself. Companionship and relationship. This is the basis for their covenant. We can look at other name changes in the Bible and see what should be, or perhaps is supposed to be, a similar relational devotion. Abraham's great-grandson Joseph is given a new name by Pharaoh in chapter 1 after Joseph becomes a part of Pharaoh's court. He's renamed Zaphanath Paneah, a name which has given rise to a number of different theories as to what this actually means, including he sees hidden things, or God speaks and he lives, or he who knows things. Regardless, the text reports the name change and then reverts back to Joseph by the end of that verse and never uses that new name again. Pharaoh's things are finite. They do not last. God things stand the test of time, even when they are sometimes slower than we would like to unfold. And of course, who can forget the famous story of the 3 Hebrew children in Babylon thrown into a fiery furnace? We all remember their names from Sunday school: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You can't say one without saying all of the others, could you? Well, perhaps you didn't recognize their Hebrew names. You recognize their Babylonian court names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are given court names when they take positions within the Babylonian palace, just as Daniel is also given a new Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. Now, I am not trying to show off all of the names that I know here with multiple H's or double Z's in the middle of them. But it does strike me as odd that in some of these cases, the name changes take hold, and in other very similar cases, the person immediately reverts back to their given name. Not so, for instance, with Jacob, when he is renamed Israel. God struggles, or the one who struggles with God, that's the Hebrew meaning for the name Israel. Not only is Jacob in relationship with God, but they struggle together with one another. In Jacob's case, he literally wrestles all night with God, pinning God, refusing to let God go until God grants Jacob a blessing. God shows themselves ready and willing to be in relationship with humanity. God's desire is for our companionship and our intimacy with God. The Jewish people take seriously the concept of Israel because it transcends land ownership. The idea of Israel is the very relationship which they have with God. The idea of Israel, which we see the seeds for in today's text here in Genesis, will yield kings and great nations, but God is at pains to underline the fact that this is a covenant between God and Abraham, an intimate person-to-person relationship. The covenant transcends place, and it transcends time. This is the narrative arc of the Bible. Joseph and his brothers carry this Israel into Egypt with them, transcending place. Moses and the Hebrew people carry it out of Egypt with them in the Exodus. When Moses sends scouts into Canaan, he changes Hosea's name, which means salvation, to a new name, Joshua, which means Jehovah is salvation, because salvation for the Israelites will only ever come through God. They carry this relationship with God every step of the way into the promised land, into exile under the Babylonians, returning from exile. When Jesus renames Simon as Peter, he actually renames him as Cephas, which is the Aramaic word for rock or stone. In Greek and Latin, this becomes Petros, a masculine form of the feminine word Petra, meaning rock or stone. The rock evokes someone who is not easily swayed, a firm, faithful presence, a solid friend, a foundation on which something might be built. And none of this is really portrayed in the gospel depictions of Peter. What does come through is Peter's utter humanity, his real desire to be a follower of Christ. He displays a real thirst to live with and to be alongside Jesus each step of the way. Perhaps by the time that people are hearing these gospel stories, they've also heard about the follower that Peter eventually becomes. They're also aware of the Peter from the Acts of the Apostles, who is a respected leader of the followers of the way, first in Jerusalem and then in other parts of the Near East. This renaming, too, offers hope for those being transformed in their relationship with Jesus. Simon, struggling to fish, this is not his final lifestyle. The Cephas, the rock, sinking as soon as he stepped out of the boat, that is not his final form. The Peter who denied Jesus will become the Peter who says yes 3 times when Jesus asks him just before the ascension, "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my sheep." Because his relationship with God is deepening and becoming more intimate and expanding in surprising, wonderful new ways, Peter is experiencing an abundant new life in his walk with Jesus. We know that coming into relationship with God means that it will stand the test of time. El Shaddai is God Almighty. El Shaddai is God on the mountain. As eternal as mountains seem to we humans, how far greater then is God's power above and beyond the mountaintop. These names all carry weight and meaning because they reveal to us God, and they reveal God to us. In our supposed unworthiness, God has called us worthy. In our supposed unlovableness, God has called us beloved, each and every one of us. God desires these relationships with us and desires our relationship with God. May we come to strive in this current Lenten season to hear and see God's revealing God's self and God's love to us. May we continue to confess our own shortcomings and our unwholeness in need of God's perfect, holistic shalom. But may we also continue to hear God's calling to us. Beloved, you are enough. No other rose will ever smell as sweet. Come, struggle with me a while.